right, so we're actually back again, and I would say that this is officially like the first video of our ABI course. The previous videos were just about installing environment tools and so on. And in this one, we're gonna take a look at the most important and basic definitions and ground rules for ABIs. Right? So relax, pay attention, and just follow. All right. All right. So here is the first slide, which is actually what we are going to know, or what you should understand, so you can actually get with this ABI course and actually understand everything in it. All right. So we are going to talk about what ABIs are, what are STBIs, or how they work, and how clients simply communicate with servers, how data is sent and received, and a lot more basics. We're going to talk about, for example, what is JSON and why we use it. Talk about the requests and the response that we will process and see, right? And talk about differences between web applications, web views based applications that run in the browser, and EBIs, and a lot more terminology, all right, and stuff. So you can understand what I'm talking about throughout the course. So do not skip this video, all right? All right, so just what is an EBI? The first thing that will come to mind if you're not actually familiar with EBIs at all. EBI basically stands for Application Programming Interface. You can think of an EBI as just a software that other programmer wrote to actually ease in your life when building applications. EBIs are basically everywhere. They're not just related to computers or web applications. And your microwave, your fridge can even like have can even have EBIs. EBIs just provide us. It's a software that provides us with information, so we can build we can build even bigger applications. All right, this is basically what an EBI is, and an EBI can also like be a software that you will use to actually, if if you want to get like the degree and the broadcast the degree sorry the degrees of cities, all right, of countries. Is it hot out there, or is it snowing, and so on. There are EBIs that can simply provide you with this. For example, if you want to create a dictionary for like from English to Arabic or Arabic to English, there are EBIs that simply has all of the information, all or most of the words between the two languages that are out there that you can simply use. And instead of course, like set a huge database and like write these words from scratch and then showing them in an interface, right? So an ABI is right there. You can simply access in some certain websites that can provide you with that, and you will be able to access this information in no time. You're just going to hit a request and then you're going to return a response, right? This is basically what an ABI is. An ABI allows different applications to communicate with each other. I already showed you this. You can have I already told you this. You can have your application or your web or your own web app, and you can simply hit an ABI. Let's say, for example, you have a payment app. You can use PayPal's ABI to simply pay for or allow users to pay for products. All that you're gonna do, you're gonna sign in PayPal and then get some certain token, install a install a PayPal package, put that token in there, and actually these configurations will allow you to simply process a payment, right along with also writing other configurations or integrating other configurations, but these are simply the basics. All right, this is basically what an ABI is. As I told you, to think of it as just a software that allows you to communicate that allows the communication between two applications, right? So instead of accessing the database directly, applications talk through ABIs. This is basically what an ABI is, and I've already told you this in the example of the dictionary, right? Without like creating a new database from scratch. You can simply call an API and he will allow you to talk to the database. And then let's say you're translating something. You're going to send in the word that you want to translate in the URL, and then you're going to get a response back, right? This is basically what an API is. Right? Simple APIs, example, simply when you open a mobile app, the app sends a request and the server processes it, right? And the server simply returns data. And this communication happens, simply happens using APIs. And the mobile app never talks directly to the database, all right? It simply talks to a back end. It can be Laravel, it can be even pure PHP, it can be anything. So this is basically what an API is. An API, which is one that we're going to create one, of course, throughout the course. That just a block API. This backend inside Laravel, we're simply going to allow us to actually talk to the database and return something, add something to the database, and so on. And a mobile developer can come in and use this backend right along with the requests, all the endpoints. The endpoint is just a request, all right, or a URL. A mobile app will use our backend to actually talk to the database, and our backend is simply going to be the API. All right, that's basically it. All right, so why API exists? I just want to give you another analogy of APIs before we even get to this. And also think of an API as like the waiter in a restaurant, right? You as a client goes into a restaurant and tries to order something. You do not talk directly to the chef, all right, or to the kitchen. You call a waiter, and then the waiter comes in and takes on your order and goes back to the kitchen and then gives it back to you. This is basically, you can think of the waiter as basically the API, right, which holds the requests and then comes back with responses, right? So why APIs exist? APIs simply exist to ease in our lives as developers, right? So APIs help us to separate the front end from the back end. As I told you throughout the course, we're going to create a back end with Laravel, all right, which is simply an API. And this API or this backend can be used to talk to the database, whether from like the front end developer, whether it's a mobile or a web front end developer, right? So APIs help us simply separate stuff. We're gonna write a separate back end, and that will communicate with our database, and the front end developers will use it to simply talk to the database. All right, and so also it allows us to simply secure the system because we're separating stuff. It also shares the data safely and it supports multiple platforms. So one backend API can be used by the front-end web developer. He can build an admin panel, for example, all right, or even a single-page application. And it can also be used by a mobile developer, whether it's Flutter, Kotlin, Java, anything. All right, so it supports multiple platforms. All right, so this is basically what an API is. It's just a concept. It's not a programming language. All right, and one API can simply serve a website, a mobile app, or even admin dashboard. So the one API that we are going to create throughout this course can be used by a lot of people to simply talk to our database. All right. So now to the next concept, which is also very, very important, which is a REST API. So REST APIs, or REST in here, stands for representational state transfer. So as I told you, APIs can vary. There are too many types or kinds of APIs out there. One of which is actually the REST API, which we are going to actually build in this course. So again, the REST API stands for representational state transfer. The REST is simply an architectural style for designing APIs. So we can think of the REST in here as just a style of writing our own APIs, which again we are going to use. And the REST API REST API follows a set of rules and best practices. We are gonna take a look at those as we go actually throughout this video. those slides or actually through the course. All right. So the REST API roles in here, the REST API roles follow these principles. All right. REST API simply use HTTP methods, which you might be familiar with, which are get, post, put, or even patch. Put and patch are very similar. They're used to update data and also delete. So these HTTP methods allows you to simply work. There are like protocols, all right, or they are you can think of them as basically ways of communication. So when you simply put a request, when you want to hit a request, you want to actually tell the server which kind of method that you want to use with this request. Do you want to get data? Then you are gonna use get. You want to like to insert data, you're gonna use post. You want to update, you can use put. You want to delete data, then you want to use delete. All right. So this is basically what HTTP methods are, and we're gonna see how can we work with those in the next video actually, which simply is about installing Postman, which is an API client, right, which allows us to simply test APIs. All right, and we're also gonna see this throughout the course, of course. REST APIs also use URLs to represent resources. All right, they use URLs. You can call them endpoints. You can call them URIs. Right, you can call them anything. You can call them requests. These are basically that's basically it. All right. So they use URLs to simply represent resources. Resources in here, you can think of them as just the models, all right, in Laravel, or even like the database tables, right? We can have a post resource, a user resource, a comment, a category, a tag resource, and just goes on and on and on, all right? One of these other roles also for STBI is it simply returns data, all right? It returns data right away. We do not deal with HTML in here, and we do not simply deal with sessions, all right? REST APIs do not deal with sessions. So every request inside the REST API is simply stateless. All right. So to carry the information of the user and to identify the user, we do not use sessions, but we use tokens. And the tokens, we are going to simply work with them once we install a package. All right, in the authentication system. Once we create the authentication system with a package that's called Sancatium. All right, and I know that things sound like a bit scary to you as I'm saying them right now, but don't worry about it. You will know everything as we actually go through the course. Right, you do not need to understand everything in just one video or one sitting. All right, so again, STBIs use HTTP methods. They also use URLs or requests to simply represent resources, and they simply return data. Right, they actually return JSON. All right. And we're going to take a look at what JSON is just in a couple of seconds. You're probably like familiar with it, all right? And also REST APIs are simply stateless, right? This is I have said this like a minute ago. They are stateless in the meaning of that every time you create a request, then it's simply independent, right? Not like web apps. In web apps, when you work with a web application or when you work with a web views based application, and you can use sessions applications. I'm talking about web applications that run in the browser, all right? When you use them, you use sessions. All right, you do not simply use tokens. So by using those sessions, you can simply track what the user is doing inside your application. But here, once we test those requests or URLs inside Postman, then we're going to actually provide a token. Right, every time we try to do something, we need to provide that token. We cannot simply set or work with sessions. All right, these are simply the rules. HTTPs also use standard status codes. These status codes are very, very famous. You might be familiar with one of them. It's actually 404, right, which means just not found. All right. They also use standard status codes to actually tell the front-end developer or show the front-end developer the response in a more friendly way. All right, and it just gives the front-end developer, whether he's mobile or actually web, some other information or some clues about the response that's coming back, right? And there are, of course, rules for writing the status codes. We will go through those as we go through the course, all right? So don't worry about it. All right, so what is a resource? Basically, a resource is a data, just a data entity. An example can be a user resource, a post resource, a commons resource, or even a products resource. And each resource, of course, will has its own endpoint, right? So throughout the course, we're gonna take a look at something that's called simply EBI controllers and EBI resources. All right, we're gonna write. EBI controllers and EBI routes. All right. So these EBI routes will work really well with those types of controllers, which are EBI controllers, right? And they will provide us with simply routes. Right, we're gonna write one line of EBI resource of EBI route. All right, and this EBI route will actually allow us to simply have access to a lot of routes for a certain resource. Again, if you do not understand everything I'm saying right now, then don't worry about it. All right, you can forget the part of the resource. You can think of a resource just for now. It's just a data entity that represents an entity inside our own database models and so on. Right, we're going to have users, entity, posts, comments, and products. We can have any kind of resource in here. All right. And for the resources, concerning the endpoints, we can have an example can be like for the posts entity, right? Can be the /EBI/posts entity like this in here, right? So we should hit something like this inside our own Postman, which will allow us to simply get certain data, insert certain data, and so on. And that varies, or that changes based on the response code. Based on the HTTP method, right? That we're gonna send right along with the route, right? All right. So how REST APIs work? REST APIs simply work using they work like this. The client will send the request, and the server will process the logic, and the database is queried, and then the response is returned. Right. This is simply the life cycle. Whether it's like inside a mobile app, or even like Postman. All right, we're gonna provide a URL, right? And we're gonna simply choose a certain type of HTTP method. We're gonna hit send, which will actually process the request, and then the server or it will send the request, and then the server will process the logic, and we're gonna get something from the database, or actually insert or update based on again our route and our route or endpoint, or and our HTTP method. All right, based on two things: the HTTP method and the route. And optional, we can send stuff in the header, right? And I'm talking about Postman. I'm talking about Postman right now. All right, you're gonna take a look at those and simply in the next video, which is about installing Postman. All right. But these are the main parts in here. We're going to send a request or hit a request. The server will process the logic and the database is required, and the response is simply returned, right? And the client does not know, of course, that we're doing this behind the scenes, all right? All right, so the client-server communication here, very quick. The clients can be web applications or even mobile applications, desktop software, or simply other servers. If you're working in a company, then you're like 90% of the time you're gonna create an API to interact with mobile applications. All right, or to work with the mobile front end application, whether it's Flutter, Java, Kotlin, anything. All right, so the content of this course is very, very important. All right, so all clients communicate with the backend using the same API backend, right? So all of these clients can interact with our database using just our API, right? Which simply represented by the API. right? The back end in here is just represented by the API, or the API backend. They're basically the same, right? So all I'm saying again, that all of that front end web application, a mobile front end, and even a desktop software, they can all interact with the database using one thing and one thing only, which is the API or the backend. And the API and the backend in this context is basically the same, right? Because as I said, the API is just code. All right, so we have in here HTTP methods overview. REST APIs use HTTP methods to define actions, and each method simply represents a specific operation. All right, we've already talked about those in a minute, or already talked about those in the past minute. That right with every request, we need to send an HTTP method that actually know or to specify what we're going to do with this request, whether we're getting data, sending data, updating data, and so on, right? So these HTTP methods are simply used by our REST APIs in here to define the action that we're going to do with the request. Right, common HTTP methods in here, I've already told you this. Get in here is simply for reading data or getting data, and the post for simply creating data, and the put is also for updating the full record, and the patch for updating only a part of the record. And we're going to take a look at both of them in the course, and the delete in here for actually removing data. Right, so you're going to specify those by your API client, which is Postman, or actually the front end mobile developer will specify them. Right. So example of HTTP requests in here can be GET. So we can, for example, these are just endpoints for working with posts. These are simply a post resource. So here we can use a GET method for actually returning all the posts. So we're going to hit /API/posts in here to actually return posts. And here we can just insert new posts by using this post method in here. So get for getting data and post for inserting or creating new resource or record. Here we can hit the API/post. So they're basically, as you can see, they're basically the same route. But the different thing is the method, the HTTP method in here, right? It actually makes a huge difference, as we're going to see throughout the course. And here we can go for a pod in here, which is concerned with updating. We can hit also the /API/post and then slash and send in a parameter, so we will know which post that we're trying to update. All right. You might be wondering about the /API prefix in here. This is a prefix that added to every route by default once you're going to work with APIs. All right, this is simply added by Laravel. All right, and we're also going to see we're also going to take a look at patch. So patch in here, so it's the same as pod, but patch for updating a partial resource or just a part of a resource, right? And also we have delete in here. For the delete, we're going to send /API/post and simply /1 like this. And this will simply allow us to delete a resource that has, or to delete the record that simply has the ID of 1. Right? These are simply parameters. All right. So each method has simply just a clear responsibility, as you can see. All right. So API request structure in here, an API request usually contains an HTTP method, as I said, a URL or an endpoint, as they are called, and also headers. Sometimes you're gonna send this, and we're gonna send this. And a lot of actually requests once we work with Postman as we go through the course, and sometimes we're also going to send a body. So the body is just concerned, it's a tab inside Postman that we can send the data, that we can simply send the data in, the data that we want to insert or update. All right, that's basically it. An example can be in here, post, and we're gonna hit, this is the HTTP method, and then we're gonna hit /API/post like this. And we can send this in here, content type application /JSON, something like this. We can actually send it in the headers tab inside Postman, and this will allow us to actually let Postman know that we're expecting an data type JSON to actually return. All right, this is basically what we have in here. Sometimes also we're going to send other things like the tokens, for example. If the routes are protected, or if they're only for the authenticated users, All right. Again, if you don't understand everything, if some things do not make sense, that's totally fine. All right. You do not need to understand everything in just one video. All right. Request body. So of course, doing the request and working with the headers, working with the method, the endpoint, and processing a request will result in a response. And the response is just gonna give us simply well, sorry about that. The body in here, the body, as I told you, if we're sending data, let's get back in here again. These are simply going to allow us to insert data using this request, and then we can send this in the headers. But the data that we want to insert, we are going to put it right inside the body. It's also a tab in Postman, right? It can be something like this, all right? It will be JSON, a JSON object like this, and inside it, we're going to set the title, and we're going to go for our data, and then we're going to go a body, and these are going to be like columns in our table, can be posts, right? And the body, we're going to also insert a body in here, all right? These are simply dynamic data that we can set as whatever that we want, but these in here, the title and the body, are actually are specified since we create our tables in a database when working with models and so on, right? So data is simply usually sent as JSON, all right? JSON is a format, is a data format that we use to simply send data and receive data once we work with APIs, right? We're gonna take a look at the slide about it just in a second. Right, so API response structure in here, API responses usually contain right after we process a request, we get a response, of course. So the response will contain something like this. It will contain the status code, it will contain a message, and also can contain data, and it will contain errors. Sometimes we're going to have errors. That's totally fine. All right. There are actually scenarios for handling errors because they will happen. All right. And we're going to have validation for all of this and so on once we go through the course. All right, an example of a response, something like this, also JSON. Here we can see status. We're going to set this inside the code. I'm going to show you, of course, how to return JSON responses inside your backend and so on. So here we can send if the post is actually created perfectly, and if there is nothing wrong, then we're going to go status and then show and then go message and simply post created successfully like this, and then we're going to send in the data that's coming back. But here I just set it to be empty. All right, and we can send the data that's simply inserted. All right, which is actually this data. All right. So yeah, this is how requests and responses work inside, whether it's Postman, essentially Postman, and also mobile apps in general. All right, let's now get to an important part, which is the common HTTP response code. So APIs communicate results using HTTP status codes, and these are very, very important to actually let the front end developer know what's going on and what happens, and how he can simply benefit from the response that simply comes in right after we process a request. All right, because every request of course has its own response, or after you hit a request, a response happens. So you can think of these status codes are just clues that the front end developer actually looks at to know what's going on with the response. All right, so we have a couple of them in here. If a response code went back as 200 means success, right? And if it went back to 101, it means created successfully, which is used for new resources that are created. Of course, inside our code, I'm gonna show you how you simply set them. All right, I would say almost every response will have its own status code. So you actually need to know a couple of them and implement them right after returning responses, right? Or actually, when writing the code for the response, you're gonna pass them in as a parameter right inside the JSON response function, right? We're gonna take a look at this in the course. So again, 200 means success. We're gonna send something like this. It's mainly sent when getting data successfully, and 200 mainly sent 201 mainly sent when creating a new resource, creating a new post, category, anything. So it's sent right along with the response. Also have 400 in here, which actually means bad request when something simply wrong happens. And we also have 401 response code, which means unauthorized. So if somebody tries to access a protected route that he should be accessing, if he is only authenticated, then we're going to return something like this, 401. All right. And we also have 403, which means forbidden. All right, we also have 404. You're probably familiar with this. Someone is asking for an endpoint or for a route that simply does not exist. We can go for the validation and send in the 404 like this. We also have 422, which is actually means validation error. So if somebody, if we set some certain validations when inserting new posts, for example, and the user violated those rules. He forgot an input. He inserted the wrong type of data inside of whether it's inside the application or simply Postman. Then we're gonna return something like this. Right? We also have 500 in here, which means server error. Again, if something happens to the server in here. All right. So the status codes help clients understand what happened. All right. You can think of the client in here as just a mobile developer or the mobile applications, right? Both of them can mean both of them. Right. So now let's get to another important part, which is JSON. I know that I have been talking a lot, but this is very important. JSON here stands for JavaScript Object Notation, which is basically a lightweight data format, which allows us to simply exchange data between systems. So JSON is everywhere. It's simply a way of processing, getting back data to the server. Right. This is simply how APIs simply work. How they work and interact with the database. And it's very, very easy to use, especially compared to something that was used in the past, which is actually XML, right? XML was used in the past, but JSON actually is very lightweight and it's very human friendly. And installing Postman, in the video of installing Postman, the next video, or it's basically the next video, you're gonna see it, all right? I think you're already familiar with it if you even like know a bit of JavaScript. All right, a JSON example in here can be something like this. Here we have just, this is a very simple JSON object. Here we have an ID. This can be like for a post, and we have the ID as 1, and the title of this post is post title, and the views, the number of views for this post can be like 120, right? So JSON supports objects, arrays, and nested data. This is just a very, very basic example of JSON object. Inside this object, we can have 2 mini arrays in here, not just these instances and elements. Right? We can also like have objects inside one object, one bigger object. Right? So we can have nested data, we can have arrays, we can have arrays inside arrays, and so on. Right? But this is a very basic example again, and we're gonna take a look at what most of what I said in here inside the course, or as we go through the course. All right, so why APIs use JSON? JSON is used because it's easy to read and easy to parse. It's also language independent, so it's used in, I would say, in every programming language out there, whether it's Java, PHP, C#, it's used everywhere. All right, it's supported everywhere, as I said. So that's why APIs simply return JSON instead of HTML. All right, and mostly because HTML are for web views based applications, but here we're working with APIs. Right. Now a quick comparison between the two, web-based applications based or simply APIs in general, and web applications. So a web application basically returns HTML. It works in the browser mainly, right? It also uses sessions to track the users when simply they do certain actions. It uses sessions, not tokens. All right, it uses sessions and cookies. It also uses Blade templates. If we're talking about the concept, if we're working in a context of Laravel, Laravel works with Blade templates and simply returns HTML. All right, and you can simply use sessions when working with it. And web applications run only in the browser. All right, but an API in here, on the other hand, returns JSON object and simply uses tokens. And as I told you, we're gonna work with those. And then next in the section that's related to Syncatium, the Syncatium package and the authentication, right? And the API in here, there are new views, all right? And we simply it works with any client, right? It's a lot integratable. It works with any client, whether it's mobile or it works with front end clients like mobile, web, and also desktop, right? So APIs are highly integratable. But throughout the course, we're going to use mainly Postman to interact with our own API, which is also considered a client. All right. So if you made it till this video, I know it was very long. I want to actually thank you and say congratulations. You're you're very consistent and you're very diligent. I want to say do not forget to write a review for the course, and simply do not skip the next video if you actually want to know how to install Postman. But if you already know Postman, if you already installed it, if you already know JSON, then you're free to actually not watch it. But I don't think that watching it will actually harm you. All right. So yeah, this is basically what I have for you in this video, and just keep going and get to the next video and install Postman and actually enjoy the rest of the course. Bye.